Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that, well, it bumps up against our basic understanding of right and wrong. Kleptomania. We've got a fascinating set of sources that look beyond, simple stealing
Right.
and delve into it as a genuine impulse control disorder.
Exactly. We're aiming to unpack what drives this persistent urge to take things.
Things you don't need.
Often things you don't need or even want, really. We'll explore its history, the different ideas about causes, diagnosis.
How professionals try to help.
Yeah, the treatments. Think of it as getting a real understanding of something that might seem straightforward, but, well, turns out to be quite complex.
Right, because when we hear about someone stealing, there's often an immediate judgment, isn't there?
Definitely.
We think about motives like, need or greed. So from the get-go, I think it's important for us to recognize, well, we might have assumptions.
Assumptions about why someone would take something that isn't theirs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what we're diving into today is a completely different kind of compulsion.
Something far removed from planned theft?
Yeah, driven by necessity or the item's actual value.
Absolutely. This isn't someone taking food because they're hungry or grabbing something valuable to sell.
Right.
Kleptomania, which was actually first identified way back, almost 2 centuries ago.
Yeah, 1816.
Yeah, around then. It operates on a different level entirely.
So that fundamental question, why would someone do that?
That's where it gets interesting because the usual answers just don't apply here.
Okay, so let's really get into the nuts and bolts. What exactly defines kleptomania? How is it different from, say, shoplifting?
Well, the core of it, the real defining feature, is this powerful recurring urge.
An urge to steal.
An urge to steal items that the person doesn't truly need, often doesn't even have a use for.
Okay.
Psychiatrically, it's classified as an impulse control disorder.
Meaning trouble resisting urges.
Yeah, difficulty resisting these specific urges to steal. What's really intriguing, though, is how it overlaps with other things.
Like what?
Well, it shares characteristics with obsessive-compulsive disorders.
Intrusive thoughts, repetitive behaviors.
Exactly. And it also has similarities to addictive behaviors, even mood disorders.
Huh. So it's kind of complex.
It's like a puzzle, yeah. Pieces fitting into different categories. And while the brain chemistry isn't fully mapped out, the overlap with things like substance use suggests it's not just a bad habit. It might be tapping into, fundamental reward systems in the brain.
Which would make it incredibly hard to control.
Extremely difficult.
That sounds like a much more significant internal struggle than just like deciding to take something.
Oh, definitely.
What are the telltale signs? What does someone experiencing this actually go through?
Well, it typically starts with these persistent, intrusive thoughts about stealing.
Okay.
Then comes this mounting tension, like a pressure building up, an inability to fight off the urge.
And then the act itself.
What follows the act of stealing is often a release of that pressure, a sense of relief, sometimes even gratification.
But it doesn't last.
No, not usually followed by happiness or anything like that. Instead, there are often significant feelings of guilt, remorse.
Intense distress.
Intense distress, yeah. And the secrecy, the shame around it all, that can make diagnosis tricky.
Especially because it often happens alongside other things.
Exactly. It so often co-occurs with other mental health conditions.
That cycle of buildup, action, then the crash of guilt sounds incredibly difficult to live with.
It really is.
When we try to understand where this comes from, what are some of the main ideas our sources explore?
Our sources point to a few different angles. Initially, the dominant ideas came from psychoanalysis.
Right, the early psychological theories.
Yeah, these early models suggested kleptomania could be a symptom of deeper unconscious conflicts.
Like what kind of conflicts?
Some theories proposed it was symbolic, like compensating for a feeling of loss, real or maybe anticipated.
Interesting.
Others saw it as a defense mechanism, a way to cope with anxieties or, forbidden desires lurking beneath the surface. Even French psychiatrists had a view suggesting maybe it was just the allure of the object, the thrill of the act itself.
And the treatment back then reflected that.
For quite a while, yeah. The primary way to address it was through psychoanalytic therapy, trying to uncover those underlying conflicts.
So digging deep into the subconscious.
Exactly. That historical view really focused on those hidden psychological roots.
It's fascinating how those early explanations looked inward. But our sources also show a shift, right? Towards looking more at learned behaviors and thought patterns.
Exactly. Cognitive behavioral models, CBT, gained traction later on.
And how do those models see it?
They often look at how behaviors are learned and reinforced. So the act of stealing might, in some cases, lead to a feeling of excitement or relief.
A kind of reward.
A kind of reward, yeah. And if there aren't immediate negative consequences, like getting caught,
It reinforces the behavior.
it can unintentionally strengthen the behavior. Over time, this can create really strong connections between certain situations or feelings and the urge to steal.
Like triggers.
Strong cues, yeah. Behavioral chains. These models also point to distorted thinking.
What kind of distorted thinking?
Well, maybe someone thinks, I deserve this, or it's just a small thing no one will notice, or even feeling entitled or needing to prove something.
Okay.
And importantly, stealing can become this maladaptive way to cope.
Cope with stress.
Stress, sadness, anxiety. A way to temporarily escape those feelings, even though it obviously creates bigger problems later.
So the act itself becomes a learned coping mechanism almost.
That's a good way to put it.
And then we also have the biological perspective, looking at the brain itself.
Yes, the biological models. These have developed largely from, well, seeing how certain medications can sometimes help.
How so?
The fact that drugs affecting neurotransmitters, those chemical messengers in the brain, like serotonin and dopamine, can sometimes have a positive impact, suggests these brain chemicals might play a role.
Okay.
Studies using opioid antagonists are particularly interesting.
What are those?
They block the effects of the body's natural opioids, like endorphins. And these studies suggest a possible link to the brain's reward system, that rush people sometimes report after stealing.
So it connects to pleasure pathways.
Potentially, yeah. There's also the self-medication idea,
Which is?
that stealing might trigger the release of these natural opioids, providing temporary relief from negative emotions. A bit like a short-term fix for feeling bad.
That's a really concrete way to think about it, how the act might interact with our brain's reward pathways. But there was that surprising thing in our sources too, wasn't there? About SSRIs.
That's a crucial point. Really highlights the complexity.
What was it again?
While SSRIs, those antidepressants affecting serotonin, are sometimes used to treat kleptomania,
Right.
there have also been cases reported where these same medications seem to trigger kleptomania in some individuals.
Wow. So they can cause it too.
In some rare cases, it seems. It just reminds us we don't have all the answers yet. The brain is incredibly intricate.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like no single simple cause. So given that complexity, how do professionals actually diagnose it? What are the key criteria?
Well, they use the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Think of it as the guidebook.
Okay.
The DSM-IVTR, which our sources mention, lists specific things. First, the repeated failure to resist urges to steal things.
Things that aren't needed, low value.
Exactly. Things not needed for personal use or for their monetary value. Second, there's usually a feeling of increasing tension or excitement right before the theft.
The buildup.
The buildup, yes. Third, the act itself leads to pleasure, gratification, or relief.
The release.
The release. And finally, crucially, the stealing isn't done out of anger or revenge.
Or because of delusions.
Right, not due to delusions or hallucinations. These criteria really emphasize the compulsive nature, driven by an internal urge, not external reasons.
Got it. Those criteria paint a clear picture. Now, our sources also make it really clear that kleptomania often doesn't happen in isolation.
That's a really important aspect. Comorbidity, it's called.
Meaning it exists alongside other conditions.
Frequently, yes. We see it alongside anxiety disorders, eating disorders, especially bulimia nervosa.
Interesting link.
Also problems with alcohol and substance use and mood disorders, particularly depression.
Can depression cause it or result from it?
It can go both ways. Depression might come first or happen at the same time or develop because of the distress and shame from the kleptomania.
Wow. It sounds like a network of interconnected challenges.
It often is, rather than a single, isolated issue.
And there's also that possible connection to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yes, because kleptomania involves both impulsive actions and, in some ways, this repetitive cycle.
Right.
There's been thought that it might be related to the obsessive-compulsive spectrum, but the research on how often they actually occur together, well, it's been a bit inconsistent.
So the link isn't totally clear yet.
The exact nature of it is still being explored. We also see connections with other impulse control disorders.
Like what?
Like pyromania, the urge to set fires.
Another powerful, hard-to-understand urge.
Exactly. These connections help show how kleptomania fits into this broader category of difficulties with managing impulses.
And that connection to substance use disorders seems quite significant, too, based on our sources.
Absolutely. There are really striking similarities.
In what way?
Think about it. Strong urges, difficulty controlling them despite negative consequences,
Ah,
the craving beforehand, the feeling of relief or pleasure during the act.
yeah, I see the parallels.
These are all features shared by both kleptomania and substance use disorders, and the fact that medications like naltrexone.
When used for addiction.
Exactly. The fact that it might also help with kleptomania provides more evidence for this link, suggests some shared underlying mechanisms in the brain, perhaps.
Okay, so given all these complexities, the potential causes, the comorbidities, how is kleptomania actually treated? Sounds like there isn't a simple fix.
You're right, there isn't. Because we don't have one clear-cut cause, the treatment approaches are varied.
You mentioned psychoanalysis was the initial approach.
It was, but the field has largely moved towards behavioral and cognitive interventions now.
Okay, CBT. What does that typically involve for kleptomania?
Cognitive behavioral therapy, yeah. It's now a primary approach. Therapists use various techniques to help people identify their triggers,
For the urges?
or the urges, yes,
Yeah.
and develop coping mechanisms, change those thought patterns we talked about.
How? What kind of techniques?
Well, things like imagining negative consequences when the urge hits. That's called covert sensitization.
Associating it with something bad,
Right, or techniques to gradually expose someone to triggering situations.
like going into a store.
Maybe, yeah, while preventing them from actually acting on the urge. That's exposure and response prevention.
Sounds challenging.
It can be. Often, combining these therapy methods with medication is seen as the most promising path.
Right, medication. What types are usually considered?
Well, as we mentioned, SSRIs are sometimes used, based on that serotonin theory for impulse control disorders. Other meds, like mood stabilizers, certain other antidepressants, have also been tried. Lithium, valproic acid, and naltrexone, the opioid antagonist we talked about, is particularly interesting.
Because it might reduce the urges.
Might reduce the intensity of the urges and maybe that reward feeling associated with stealing, similar to how it works in treating substance dependence.
But you said the evidence isn't totally solid.
Well, it's really important to emphasize that much of what we know about medication for kleptomania comes from individual case reports, smaller studies,
Big clinical trials.
not large definitive clinical trials, no. Partly because kleptomania is relatively rare, it's just hard to recruit enough people for large-scale research.
That makes sense. Studying a less common condition would be difficult. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Look at how our understanding has evolved. It wasn't always seen through this medical lens, was it?
Not at all. When French psychiatrists first started describing these behaviors, back in the 19th century, their understanding was quite different. By the late 1800s, various theories popped up, sometimes quite dismissive theories,
Dismissive how?
linking it to things like female hysteria, intellectual disability, even menopause.
Wow.
There was a tendency to see it as maybe a sign of immaturity or a moral failing, especially since young children sometimes take things.
Right.
But these early observations, flawed as they might seem now, did start the conversation, pave the way for later psychological explanations.
And that history shows how societal biases can influence things.
Definitely. How biases and maybe access to resources can shape perception, even diagnosis, of mental health issues.
And the actual term kleptomania, where did that come from?
It's Greek, combines klepto, meaning to steal,
Okay.
and mania, referring to a kind of madness or intense compulsion.
So a mad desire to steal.
Literally, yeah, a compulsion to steal.
In the early 20th century, our sources suggest a really interesting shift about social class and gender.
That's right. Early 1900s, especially in places like France, there was this growing suspicion
Suspicion about what?
that kleptomania was being used as a convenient legal excuse, particularly by wealthy women caught stealing from those new department stores.
The department store kleptomaniac.
Exactly. That became a bit of a social stereotype, sometimes with, underlying class and gender biases baked in.
Yeah. So it wasn't always taken seriously as a genuine struggle, especially if you were, say, well off.
That seems to have been part of the perception then, yeah.
And psychoanalysis weighed in again during that period.
Oh, yes. Figures like Wilhelm Stekel, he was associated with Freud, he proposed kleptomania was about repressed sexual urges.
Seriously.
Yeah, a symbolic act of taking something forbidden. Another analyst, Fritz Wittels, suggested it was linked to sexual underdevelopment, a need for thrills. It's interesting, though. Apparently, some of Steckel's more outlandish ideas were met with ridicule even back then.
Huh. Well, it really shows how our understanding of these complex behaviors is constantly being shaped, reshaped.
By different ways of thinking and the social context of the time,
Okay.
absolutely.
Our sources even touch on more recent perspectives.
Indeed. More recent research, using more, empirical methods,
Yeah.
suggests kleptomania might actually be more common than we previously thought, and could potentially affect women more often than men.
Which kind of echoes those really early observations.
It does, interestingly enough, echoes some of those 19th century views, but now with more systematic data, hopefully.
Fascinating how ideas can circle back sometimes.
Yeah.
And just to connect this to, like, our everyday experiences, kleptomania has popped up in popular culture, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You see characters with kleptomania in movies, Mary and Max, Klepto.
TV shows, too.
Yeah, the series Trinkets is a big one. Even a character arc in Breaking Bad, arguably. Various books, too.
So it's out there in the cultural consciousness.
It is. Now, these portrayals are often simplified, maybe dramatized.
Sure.
But they do show it's a concept that resonates, at least to some extent.
So as we bring this deep dive into kleptomania towards a close, what are the key things, the main takeaways you'd want our listeners to hold on to from today?
I think the most important points are, first, that kleptomania is a genuine, complex impulse control disorder.
Really distinct from typical theft.
Totally distinct, yeah.
Yeah.
Second, it likely arises from this mix of factors, psychological, behavioral, biological.
And it often co-occurs with other conditions.
Right, which makes diagnosis and treatment challenging. And third, there's still a real need for more robust research.
To guide the most effective treatment.
Exactly.
And it feels so crucial, doesn't it, to look beyond the simple act of stealing, to recognize the internal battle, the real distress someone with kleptomania experiences.
Definitely. It's not just about the item. It's about this overwhelming, often uncontrollable urge.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, this brings up a really interesting question for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
Oh.
In a society like ours, increasingly focused on consumerism, all about having things, how might those societal pressures interact with individual vulnerabilities? Could they contribute somehow to the development or the expression of impulse control disorders like kleptomania?
That's a powerful point. Looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, just something to think about.
How our societal landscape might intersect with individual mental health. It definitely encourages us, well, encourages me anyway, to think more deeply about the reasons behind people's behavior.
And appreciate the complexity.
And appreciate the intricate nature of the human mind. Well, thanks for shedding so much light on this. It's been really insightful.
Glad we could dive into it.